Hi guys, welcome to my channel and lesson 7 of the Watercolour Trip to Italy painting book. Today I'm painting a scene from Toscana, a region in central Italy, and I begin by first studying the reference photo on the left hand side and comparing this to the artist's painting on the right hand side. As always, we have 2 outline sketches for 2 attempts at this painting, and I like to separate these out using washi tape to keep any paint from spreading. So I'm going to jump straight in with step 1 of 3 and read through the whole of the instructions before I start. And straight away I could see there was a lot of the wet in wet technique in this section. So I made the decision to pre-mix all of these colours so I could take advantage of this technique to the full before I even put paint onto paper. And so before I started, I did drop a little piece of water onto each of the swatches just to activate them and get them all ready for my mixing. So the first colour I'm mixing is a 2 colour mix for the sky and tree area using indigo and viridian. I'm going to try and show you the mixing on my palette as I mix the colours, and then I'm going to be swatching them out on a separate piece of watercolour paper because often they can look very different on paper than they do in the palette. I'm then going to compare my colour swatches to those on the artist painting as well as the reference photo to see that I'm in the right place with my colours and adjust them if necessary. So for the sky I decided to add a little bit more indigo as it was looking a little bit green. The next colour that we need to get ready is some Madder Lake Deep, and that's just to drop into the sky while it's still wet. So I just put a diluted amount of this in my palette as well. Next I'm going to mix up a 3 colour mix for the trees, and that's with olive green, burnt umber and indigo. And if you didn't see last week's video, the burnt umber that I'm using today is actually one of my own as I ran out of the one in the kit. It's a Magello Mission Gold burnt umber, but I put it onto the palette and let it dry and have used it so that I can still carry on and use the rest of the kit in the same way as I have before. The indigo paint in this kit is a really strong colour, so I'm always a little bit cautious to add too much. That said though, I am really wanting to get a nice dark rich green for those trees. And to start with, I didn't quite get it, so I did add a little bit more indigo in just to kind of get that colour a little bit richer. I swatched the colour out again and compared them to the 2 different pictures and was a lot happier with this result. So this is why it's a really good idea to swatch out your watercolours and see how they turn out on paper. So the next colour we have to mix together is for the bushes, and that's olive green and burnt umber. So this is going to be a lighter green, and again I'll be testing it out on my swatch paper. The resulting mix was a little bit brown I thought to start with, so I went in and added a little bit more olive green to make it look a bit more like the reference picture. The last few colours to use on this first step were just single colours, so I thought it was about time I got started on the painting. So the first step was to pre-wash the entire sheet, and I'm going to be using my own 1/2 inch flat brush for this just because I find it a lot quicker than using the round brushes that came in the kit. With that done, on to step 2, which was to wash the sky and tree area with that 2 colour mix of indigo and viridian that we made using plenty of water. Now I'm so used to these paintings going over all the outlines that I did exactly the same this time, only this time I should have gone around the building. But I just used a towel to lift up some of that paint to try and get back to the white of the paper. Then the next part of this step was to drop in some of that Madder Lake Deep just to the bottom half of that area to give it a little bit of variation. And whilst the paper was still wet, we have to use a dry brush to lift out some of those clouds. This didn't work quite as well as I wanted to, and I think next time I need to be a bit quicker off the mark to make use of that paper while it's still wet and make the lifting process a lot easier. I did then try to add a little bit more water just to loosen up any paint and lift further, but it didn't work quite as well as I wanted it to. Now, whilst the sky was still a bit wet, we had to move on to the next step, which was adding in the colour for the trees, and that was that 3-colour mix we made up with olive green, burnt umber and indigo. I was really glad I'd mixed up these colours beforehand, because if I'd had to mix them up and swatch them out, by the time I'd done this, my paper was sure to have dried. So it's really nice to be able to get those colours mixed first, so that you can make use of the wet in wet technique and have that really nice bleeding out effect for the trees. Then it was time to add the colour for the bushes, which was the olive green and burnt umber mix. Now, one thing I did notice was that as much as I liked the bleeding out effect of the tree colour into the sky, I do think that my paper was possibly a little bit too wet, as the colour was spreading out a little bit too far. Next time, for the next attempt, I think I'll make sure that my paper possibly isn't quite so wet and try and control how far the tree spreads out into the sky area. So the next thing to do was to wash the ground with yellow ochre, and whilst that was still wet, drop in some of that Madder Lake Deep. Now, there wasn't anywhere on the instructions that said you had to wait for the trees and the bushes to dry before adding this foreground, so I was a little bit wary about going too far up to the trees in case that green colour started to bleed out onto the yellow ochre. I then added some of the Madder Lake Deep into the yellow ochre whilst it was still wet to just give it a little bit more colour, and although I couldn't see this on the reference picture for this step, I just kind of looked at the second step and also the reference photograph. The last part of this first step was to wash the house and the roof with a 2-colour mix of yellow ochre and burnt umber. And this was a very pale colour, and I did notice that some of the colour from the tree was still wet and started bleeding onto the roof area, so I just tried to lift that up with my paper towel. So we're already on to step 2, and step 2 uses the paraffin wax that we've used in a couple of the previous lessons. The instructions say to rub the roof with paraffin partly using diagonal strokes using the edge, and also to rub the ground with paraffin using circular strokes. There are also a couple of colour mixes as well, so I decided, like before, to mix these up before we started this step. So the first colour I'm going to mix up is a 2-colour mix of violet and yellow ochre. And this colour got me a bit puzzled because I wasn't entirely sure where it was. There was only a very tiny area on this reference image on step 2 that looked like it could be that colour. But then I went on and mixed up the next 3-colour mix, which was raw umber, cadmium yellow and cadmium red. And again, this looked like a really dark mix, which didn't seem too similar to any of those in the reference pictures. But I moved on and mixed up the next colour, which was raw umber and a bit of indigo. And this colour did look a bit like the colour in that middle ground there, so I kind of had a bit of a clue as where I was going with that one. So the last colour to mix up for the field was the foreground colour, which was burnt umber and raw umber. So I'd mixed up 4 different colours for 4 different areas of the field, and it just took me a few minutes to work out which was which and which order I was putting them in. So then that done, I was ready to start with the paraffin. And first off, this was quite difficult to apply even on the edge to that small area of the roof. I also had to apply some of the paraffin wax to the ground using circular strokes and using it quite flat. Then it was time to start adding some paint, and we start off with that violet and yellow ochre mixture. The next is the raw umber, cadmium yellow and cadmium red mix. Then we had to wash the field on the middle ground using raw umber and a bit of indigo. And we can start to see the texture appear where the paraffin wax laid down, although I think next time I need to do it a little bit more chaotically and less in a circle in the middle of the field. The last part of the field to paint was the foreground with the 2-colour mix of burnt umber and raw umber. So with the field done, the last part to this step 2 was to wash the roof with a 3-colour mix of yellow ochre, cadmium red and burnt umber. Again, I swatched out this colour mix onto my separate sheet of watercolour paper to make sure it was right before I added it to the painting. I decided I wanted to darken those colours up and make them a bit richer, so I went in and added a bit more cadmium red and burnt umber until I was happy that it was a little bit darker and it would show up more on the paper. And you can see just how random my paraffin streaks were on this roof, as it didn't really seem to come up too well at all. But we're on to step 3 now, and because this wasn't using the wet in wet technique, I decided to mix my colours up as I went along. So firstly we had to wash the bushes in front of the house with a 3-colour mix of burnt umber, olive green and indigo. Now to me, in the reference photograph, all the bushes and the trees look very similar in colour, so it's interesting to see that the artist has made different colour mixes for these different parts of the trees. And that's something that I do like about these painting books and about working alongside someone else's instructions, because it gets you thinking differently than you would yourself, and I think that's a great way to learn. The next step was to add shadows on the trees, partly, it says, using burnt umber and indigo. So I was keen to make up quite a nice dark colour to get those really dark shadows in. Now this tree area is certainly something that I want to improve upon in my next painting in attempt 2, because the wet in wet technique definitely bled out far too far for my liking, and it just looks like a bit of a blob, so that's something I'm really going to try hard to improve on next time. Right, the next part of this step says to add more lines on the ground using burnt umber, Madder Lake Deep, as well as burnt umber and yellow ochre. And I didn't really sure where they meant, so I just tried to gauge it using the final artist picture and look at where my painting was missing. Now my painting looked a lot paler than theirs, so I did just kind of try and fill in some of those gaps. I did find it interesting though that the artist painting was a lot more colourful. There were a lot more colour mixes than in the original photograph. So that I found really interesting, and I think also if it was just up to me painting it, I would have had the tendency to smooth out some of those lines and not leave them quite so raw. But that's something that I'm getting used to and getting a little bit more confident with. So with the field finally done, it was time to wash the shadow under the roof using a 3-colour mix of ultramarine, Madder Deep and yellow ochre, and not much water. I wasn't quite sure why we had to add the yellow ochre to this mix, seeing as the house and the roof were previously washed with yellow ochre and burnt umber together. But in any case, I added it in and applied it underneath the roof as instructed. This made kind of a violet colour, which left me thinking again, why couldn't we just have used the violet that was already in the palette? But nonetheless, I'm sure there were their reasons, and it certainly helped to make the piece cohesive having that colour in there when we'd already used it to mix in colours on the field. We then had to wash the shadow under the upper roof using Madder Deep, Violet and Ultramarine. So they did use the violet in that mix, but not in the area under the roof where we previously painted. It was then time to add the tree branches using a 2-colour mix of burnt umber and indigo. This mixture turned out to be quite grey to start with, so I went back in and adjusted it by adding in some more burnt umber to create more of a rich dark brown. I switched up to using the smaller of the 2 round brushes that came in the kit to apply these branches as finely as I could. With that done, we had to add accents to the bushes using Viridian and burnt umber and not much water. Okay, so we're almost there now, but step 7 of step 3 says to wash the windows using the Watercolour technique, which is a mixture of indigo and Madder Deep and indigo and yellow ochre. Now the windows on this building are extremely tiny, so I just tended to go with the indigo and Madder Deep and not add in that indigo and yellow ochre mix. The last instruction for this last step was to darken the roof edges above the roof shadows using burnt umber and Madder Deep. I also decided to add in at this stage some of the little chimneys that had been left out from previously and hadn't been mentioned in the instructions. I used the same shadow colour as I did for under the roofs. So technically this painting was finished now, but I decided to go in and use some of those paints up on my palette before starting attempt 2, just to pop in some extra details to that field area. But with that it was done and I was ready to take stock, start again and hopefully make some improvements on the second attempt. So the first thing I did for my second attempt was to pre-mix my colours again, because I did find that really helpful the last time. I also remembered this time to go around the building, not over it, and was quick to lift up those clouds to try and get the best effect I could and leave them as nice and white as possible. When I dropped in the colour for the trees, I did make sure my paper wasn't absolutely wringing wet, so the paint didn't spread as far as it had in the first time, and that nice dark concentrated green colour did stay a little bit more where I wanted it to, while still getting a little bit of blur around the edges. When it came to dropping in that madder lake deep into the wet yellow ochre, I decided against doing it in the area underneath the trees as I'd done before. When it came to applying the paraffin wax the second time round, I did try to be a little bit more precise and a little bit more careful as to where I was applying it. I think on the first attempts I applied it a bit heavy-handedly and perhaps not as precisely as I could, but it was still quite hard. When it came to applying the paraffin wax on the field area though, I did apply it less in circles and more in lines, following the lines of the field, and I think this did give a better and more natural result. As expected though, when I applied the paint to the roof area of the building, I hadn't made that much difference in my paraffin wax application, but I still like the result. When it came to adding the shading on the trees, I was a lot happier with how these turned out compared to the first attempt. When it came down to the field, however, they were both very different. The painting on the left-hand side, my second attempt, looked far more like the reference photo, whilst my painting on the right-hand side looked far more like the artist's painting. But I'll let you decide which you prefer. There are aspects to both that I like, but I definitely think that I like the trees as well as the sky from the second attempt. So let me know which you prefer, the first or the second attempt, and why. Just drop your comments in the box below and I'll be interested to know what your thoughts are. On first glance at this painting before I even started, it did look fairly straightforward and fairly simple, but I do think actually that I learned quite a lot from this one. I certainly learned about the order in which to do things, and I really liked preparing my paints first because I think that helped with the painting as a whole. But anyway guys, I hope you've enjoyed this video. As always, thank you for watching, and if you have missed any of the previous lessons in this Paint to Italy series, then you can catch them using the links in the cards above. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Bye!